Moving on to composition. It's an important little topic, independent of the aggregators. So let's have a closer look what we mean by it. Essentially, it means how would we go about building complex applications out of reusable components. In particular, is there some way in which we can regard our view models as independent and then make decisions quite late as to how we like to combine the view models into different user experience screens. Homogeneous composition is something you're already familiar with. If we're building a list or a table, for instance, it's easy enough to envisage how we can add items onto the list or the table. Each item we add on, usually in a loop of some kind, is just an LI or maybe a table row. Fairly easy to understand how it works, and they're all of uniform structure. We don't need any extra composition syntax or directives for this. It's just more or less handled by simple iteration in HTML. You've seen that in the Aurelia application with our list of donations. In particular, you can see how we can just augment the number of rows just by this simple repeat for syntax here. That repeat for syntax is the syntax equivalent to an each loop in handlebars. Don't have to do anything in the view model, of course. All this is handled entirely in the view. Heterogeneous composition is a bit more interesting. This would be, we're trying to compose a page where each thing we're composing, each component, if we call it that, could be of a different type. A header, a sidebar, footer, widgets of various kinds being positioned independently. Having the ability to do this kind of composition gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of designing our applications. Once we have a suite of pre-built components, we could adjust them and place them in different contexts depending on what the application demanded. In Aurelia, we do this via the compose element, and we've already been using it. An example then, we've been doing this already. We want to make a donation. We want to list out donations to date, and we also want our stats view, which is showing the current total. Maybe we're ignoring the add candidate in this instance. 3 view model pairs. We could create a class called app, which doesn't do anything, and we can establish that composition entirely in the view part of the app view model. That, as you can see in here, I've got this compose statement, and I say compose view minus model equals view models donate, and that's pulling in this view model here. So we're seeing that rendered into the view at that point. And the same with the other two. The report appears to the right and the stats appears on the bottom left. Maybe it's gone to an extra row here as far as we've according to our layout. So that's achieved by the compose tag, we'll call it, in the view model framework. Now when we're binding, of course, it is possible to perform some experiments here with how views and view models are bound. And we might like to have a view model without any explicit binding taking place. So here on the left we have a view which is this form. We've got these binding statements here that we hope will trigger a possible login statement, and also a possible binding to these attributes that would exist in the view model. However, what if we don't have a view model in mind, or if we want different view models to be associated with this view? Well, this can be done as follows. It's similar enough to what we've just looked at, except draw your attention to one change in syntax, which is here. We're composing a view, not a view model. So the view model, login.html, single view is loaded, and we're using just the keyword view as opposed to the word view model. Now what does that do for our binding? Because we do have bind candidates here we've already identified. Well, they can be bound to the application object, and that's what we do in the lab. So app is our view model. The app view model, remember, is associated with this view. That is the view that contains the composition statements. One of those compose statements, as we pointed out, is view only, not view model, which means that that view is bound to app. So the events of interest, then the login event, will be triggering this method here, and similarly the username and passwords will be bound there to the input field that we have in the view here, similarly with the password. So login is composed as a view, not a view model, and we're binding it to the app. One more feature then, selected display. What if I want to build a heterogeneous composition, but I only want some view models visible? A convenient feature here in Aurelia called showbind. And showbind, if we associate it with a element containing our composed view, means it'll only be displayed if a given condition is true or false. Think about this now for a second. I'd like to show a login view, and if the user logs in, I'm going to set this flag here to true. By default it's false. So if the user logs in, we'll set it to true, as we're doing here. And if it's true, well, that affects the composed views and view models I'd like to display. And this is what's happening here on the right. I've got showbind in two places. Here, showbind all these views if and only if logged in is true. And over here, I've showbind this view, but only do it if the Boolean logged in is false. So the effect of that is quite simple. It means we're going to get displayed on the screen a login screen, and if the user logs in successfully, that'll be hidden and all the other views will appear immediately. I don't have to do any extensive logic. I don't have to do any extensive hiding or removing or showing or displaying. It's all triggered automatically by the application. Okay, a few comments here on delegate versus trigger. We've been using, we do have both available to us. It's worth reading up a little bit on the difference between the two. We're largely going to be using the trigger, but delegate is used in certain circumstances with more complicated event controls. I don't think we need to worry too much about it. Okay, that's it for the moment.